The number of climate deniers in Congress has been steadily decreasing, but they make up about half of the Republican caucus. In addition to the outright deniers, there are loads of people, including almost every Republican member of Congress, who argue against taking action in dealing with climate pollution. They call bills like the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act industrial policy, or picking winners and losers, or subsidizing Wall Street with money taken from Main Street. And they have a point. But what if there was a policy that didn't increase an individual's taxes, didn't pick winners and losers, yet created a financial environment that led to increased private funding for the building of a low-carbon economy? And it was fast and easy to implement, at least compared to the current approach, which can take years to make a difference on the ground. Well, there is such a policy. And conservatives who actually want to act on preserving our climate, and many others really like it. It's called putting a cost on carbon. Now, when we say carbon, we actually mean greenhouse gases, the most important of which is carbon dioxide, and the second most important is methane, which is carbon and hydrogen. What we're talking about here is carbon dioxide equivalent. So greenhouse gases are treated like the equivalent amount of carbon dioxide. I talked a bit about this on my series on greenhouse gases. So, for the duration of this video, when I say carbon, I mean carbon dioxide equivalent of all significant greenhouse gases. There are two basic approaches to putting a cost on carbon. The first is a carbon tax. You simply say that if you emit a ton of carbon, you must pay a tax on it. This is a Pigovian tax, sometimes referred to as a sin tax. The idea is that every ton of CO2 emitted contributes to the damage done to the planet, which is often referred to as the social cost of carbon. There's a lot of uncertainty in the social cost of carbon. I've seen estimates from as low as $50 a ton and as high as $185 a ton. If we suddenly imposed the true social cost of carbon, it would crash the economy. And the carbon tax doesn't need to be set that high, but it should be at the level to get the maximum amount of reduction in emissions with the least disruption. An ideal carbon tax starts low and follows a known path, increasing every year. So when utilities are planning for the future, they know there's going to be a large tax, so they build solar and wind farms, not coal and gas plants. When you buy a car, the tax might not be high now, but it will be over the life of the car, so you buy a more efficient one. And this encourages all industries to build more efficient products, from electronics to cars to power plants. The tax is paid as far up on the supply chain as possible. For instance, for gas, it should be paid by the refinery. For electricity, it should be paid by the power plants, not by the individual consumer. What you do with the money isn't as important. You can do a tax and dividend where you add up all of the money collected and return it to everyone equally. So the average person would pay as much in as they got back. Sometimes this is called a carbon fee rather than a carbon tax, since it isn't used to fund government operation. Another approach is a tax and invest. Spend the money building infrastructure, research, or other actions that accelerate the decarbonization journey. A third approach is just to cut other taxes. The first is the best politically, and the second is probably the best for decarbonization, but all three work. And you can do a mixture. For instance, spend half the revenue on a dividend and half the money on improving the electrical grid. The other approach is an emissions trading system, or ETS, sometimes called a cap and trade. Here, rather than a fixed cost, we have a fixed amount of carbon reduction, a cap. Polluters must buy credits in an auction. The more they pollute, the more credits they need to buy. And the number of credits auctioned off each year shrinks, which will increase the cost of the credit if industry doesn't reduce emissions by the same amount. The system gives society a certainty into how much the emissions will be reduced, but it creates uncertainty for businesses, which they hate. In some implementations, legacy players are given free allowances based on their historical emissions. But I think that's a bad idea, since it gives these players an unfair advantage over new entrants into the market. You have the same options with the revenue raised by the auctions as with a tax, a dividend, invest, or cut other taxes. And there's a good history of cap and trade systems working. Remember acid rain? If you're under 40, you might not. In 1990, the world's first cap and trade system was created in the US to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions from power plants by 50% below 1980 levels by 2010. Rather than telling utilities how to operate their power plants, which is called the command and control regulation, the government just told utilities to figure out how to cut emissions the best way they could. And if they didn't, they'd have to buy more allowances. Some switched to low sulfur fuels, some added scrubbers, others switched from coal to natural gas. If you had an old power plant and you were going to replace it in a few years, you just might buy allowances until then. And as new technology came along, it could be integrated more quickly than updating a regulation. The utilities were allowed to meet the goal in the way that made sense to them. And the goal was achieved by 2007 at a cost that was considerably lower than it would have been with a command and control approach. Of course, a tax could have accomplished this as well. As long as the cost is fairly predictable and growing and significant, it will lead to reduced emissions, whether you impose an emissions trading system or a tax. Hydrogen is a great example of where a cost on carbon could be critical to putting us on a decarbonization path. Currently, almost all hydrogen is produced with the steam methane reforming process, which is very carbon intensive. Alternatively, you can take electricity produced by wind or solar and run it through an electrolyzer, which produces no CO2, but is much more expensive. If the carbon tax is high enough, then hydrogen produced with renewable electricity will be competitive with traditional hydrogen. Without a cost on carbon, we could end up replacing fossil fuels with high carbon hydrogen, making things worse instead of better. One of the arguments against putting a cost on carbon is it will put our industries at competitive disadvantage to those from other countries. But this is largely unfounded and easily remedied. It's unfounded because most of our trading partners already have a cost on carbon, as we can see in this map. Canada, Mexico, the EU, the UK, China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and India all have an emissions trading system or a carbon tax, or both. The current level of the cost on carbon varies from $8 in South Korea to over $80 in the EU. If the US introduced a carbon tax that was higher than our trading partners, the solution to what's called carbon leakage is a carbon border tariff. The EU is implementing one, which I covered in this video. In short, if a product that requires a lot of energy to produce, like steel, is imported, then a tariff is applied at the border to compensate for the lower carbon cost in the producing country. This allows European producers to compete on a level playing field with their counterparts. Ideally, a carbon border adjustment is implemented at the same time as the cost on carbon. So if putting a cost on carbon is such a great idea and it's so common around the world, what's the status for the US? 5 carbon tax bills were submitted during the 117th Congress. Of the 49 authors and co-authors, there was only one Republican. And I'm not sure that bill even counts, since it repeals the motor and aviation fuel taxes, which are sort of a carbon tax, and it has several gaps like not counting methane. Of these bills, one, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, was resubmitted in the 118th Congress that is currently in session. This is a pure carbon tax and dividend bill with a carbon tariff. It starts low and increases at a reasonable rate. None of these bills made it out of committee. Actually, none of them even got a vote in committee. Until the Republicans start treating climate change as a real problem, it's hard to imagine a cost on carbon passing Congress. So maybe we need to treat a carbon tax like gay marriage and marijuana and start at the states. Those along the Pacific Coast and the Northeast have created state-level carbon pricing schemes, including the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, which is pronounced RGGI, which covers states from Maine to Virginia with a cap and invest scheme for the power sector. RGGI has quarterly auctions, and the most recent one had a price of $21 per ton and raised about $1/3 billion. The money raised by the auctions primarily goes to funding energy efficiency programs and helping low-income people pay their energy bills. They also fund electrification and greenhouse gas abatement, like capturing the powerful greenhouse gases that I discussed in my ozone video. But many of the difficulties in getting a cost on carbon at the national level apply at the states as well. For instance, in Washington state, a group of activist economists, I bet you didn't know there was actually such a thing, actually got a carbon tax and dividend initiative, I-732, on the ballot in 2016. But it was not supported by environmental or labor groups and opposed by business groups, and so it failed in the ballot. In 2018, environmental and labor groups submitted I-1631, the Washington Carbon Emissions Fee and Revenue Allocation Initiative, a carbon tax and invest scheme that had requirements for union labor and investments in worthwhile projects, but it also failed at the ballot. I think part of the reason the carbon tax failed the second time is that the business groups were able to get the negative messaging on a carbon tax to stick on the first initiative that was not supported by those on the left. In 2021, the Washington State Legislature passed the Climate Commitment Act, which is an economy-wide cap-and-invest scheme. A right-wing group largely funded by a single hedge fund manager has 2117 to repeal it on the ballot. Hopefully that will fail. Those opposing the Climate Commitment Act aren't arguing for a better way of dealing with climate pollution. They're just saying they care more about cheap gas than their grandchildren. Where there is a low carbon substitution, a cost on carbon can work well. For instance, in supplying electricity, utilities can replace fossil fuels with wind and solar and storage. But building the transmission lines is not just a matter of money. Getting the permits have lots of challenges that aren't related to costs, which I've covered previously. So a carbon tax alone will not solve the problem. A cap and invest strategy can give the government the resources needed to solve some of these harder issues by building infrastructure like transmission lines and EV charging stations. But for those hard to decarbonize sectors, a cost on carbon won't magically make it easy. For instance, a carbon tax will make flying more expensive, but airlines are already flying the most efficient airplanes available. And in the US, there is rarely a reasonable alternative to flying. And as I've discussed in this video, I don't believe that sustainable aviation fuels are a scalable low-carbon solution, at least not for the short term. So a cost on carbon will only reduce emissions from aviation in the short term by reducing flying. It will increase the incentives for aircraft manufacturers to deliver even more efficient airplanes, like I discussed in this video, but that's not going to make a difference for over a decade. Putting a cost on carbon is not a panacea, but it is as close to one as we're going to see. Easy things just happen, and hard things become easier. This is a policy that we should be talking about more. It's a shame that the political party that claims to trust the market and small government doesn't support the only market-based small government approach to fighting climate change. If you'd like to support my work, you can buy me a beverage. If you've learned something, please like and subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. And if you have some thoughts on putting a price on carbon, please leave a comment. And share the video with everyone you know who understands that without taxes, we have no roads, no bridges, no schools, no police, and putting a cost on carbon is a great way to raise funds for those things.